We are here, Department of Housing, along with DFSS, and are going to talk to everybody about our request for proposals that we put out for shelter operators for our non-congregate shelter acquisition program. So thanks for joining us today. So our quick agenda here is that we're going to quickly look at the Chicago Recovery Plan. And then we're going to talk about the non-congregate shelter acquisition program, give you all an overview. After that, we are going to go through the solicitation itself. So we'll give a little bit of an overview on the RFP, how it works, and what outcomes we're looking for. And then we will answer some of your questions. So if you have questions, Q&A feature is activated, so please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and at the end, we'll actually have you answer questions verbally or ask questions verbally if you want to. But first, we're going to do a quick poll. So there should be a poll coming up. If you just put what type of organization you're from, that would be helpful.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everyone. So I'm hoping you can see the poll results on your screen. I'm not entirely sure of that, but looks like we've got about over 60% of folks representing homeless shelters, a few folks in representing homelessness outreach organizations, and then one or two folks in the rest of each of the rest of the categories. So thank you all for being here. Really excited to have be able to be here and talking about this RFP, and excited to be moving this program forward. So we appreciate you all being here. My name is Matt Stern. I manage Chicago Recovery Plan investments at the Department of Housing. And this program falls sort of within, it's being funded with Chicago Recovery Plan dollars. So I'm excited to sort of kick off the webinar today with just a very brief introduction to what the Chicago Recovery Plan is, what it funds overall, and what of those funds are available for services within or programs within the homelessness services section, and sort of positioning this grant and this program within that larger context. So just briefly, the Chicago Recovery Plan was born out of COVID, the sort of health and economic impacts of COVID, and the federal government's passage of ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, which set aside substantial funding for state and local governments around the country to both pay for essential city services that were needed during the pandemic, as well as to support pandemic recovery efforts. Here in Chicago, we were allocated about $1.9 billion from that fund, which is called the Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. And in addition to that, the mayor's office decided to go to City Council and request approval for an additional $660 million of funding to support recovery efforts via a general obligation bond. So you put all that together, and that funding, over $2 billion, was made available both for essential city services, and about half of those funds ended up being spent on those essential city services. And then the other half, $1.2 billion, was programmed in late 2021 into the Chicago Recovery Plan. That recovery plan is sort of broken up into two main sections: thriving and safe communities and equitable economic recovery. Within the Chicago Recovery Plan, there are 5 different programs that directly support homelessness services and homelessness support activities in the city. Permanent supportive housing, that's a $35 million investment in new permanent supportive housing buildings. The non-congregate housing program, which we'll be talking about extensively today, as well as a chunk of funds to be used for rapid rehousing, another collection of resources for shelter infrastructure investments, and then finally a category for the creation of a high utilized or diversion housing program, which is a CDPH program that is now referred to as a stabilization housing program since the implementation of the plan originally. I want to focus on 3 of those 5 programs just for a minute because they are related to each other, but they are different from each other. And so I want to talk for a minute about what we are and are not talking about today and sort of contextualize this program in this sort of broader world of funding that will be rolled out over the coming years. So this acquisition of new non-congregate shelter program, this is a capital investment money that is set aside to acquire new shelter units in decompressed settings. Department of Housing is primarily responsible for allocating these funds, but we're working closely with DFSS and CDPH in figuring out how to most effectively do that. And this RFP that Meredith and Ryan and Kim and others will be talking about over the next half an hour is a outgrowth of that program. That's the maroon box on your screen right now. Separately from that, DFSS also has a shelter infrastructure investments budget. They are currently working on a separate solicitation process for those funds. The distinction here that I want to be sure to draw is that the program we're talking about today is about acquiring new shelter units in new buildings, whereas the program that DFSS is going to launch I believe is primarily focused on providing grants to shelters to improve existing shelter sites, although that solicitation isn't yet launched. So more on that in the coming months. I also want to mention the stabilization housing program. This is a CDPH program that will be standing up in the coming 3 to 6 months, a new pilot transitional housing model specifically targeting a homelessness population that can particularly benefit from a series of wraparound services. We're really excited to be working with CDPH on helping them find space for that project. But that is also not something we're specifically talking about today. And so I wanted to sort of walk through that a little bit. I also want to clarify that anything that's funded from that general obligation bond within the Chicago Recovery Plan has to be used for capital investments. And so these top 2 buckets today fit that category. So these funds have to be used for the acquisition or rehabilitation of new space. They can't, for example, be used to support ongoing operations of new or existing shelters. The same is true for DFSS's Shelter Infrastructure Investment Program, where the stabilization housing program is coming from that other side of the Chicago Recovery Plan. So I want to make that clear. And when we get to the Q&A, I'm happy to clarify that if anyone has any further questions on that. And so I think that's my last slide. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kim and Meredith.
All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kim Howard. I'm the director with the Homeless Services Division at the Department of Family and Support Services.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Meredith Muir. I'm with the Department of Housing. I'm one of the Chicago Recovery Plan program manager. Kim and I are going to be talking today about the sort of overview of the non-congregate shelter acquisition program. So I will pass it back to Kim to do some context.
So first of all, I just want to say, we are so excited to be sort of at this point of making this funding opportunity available and grateful to be partnering with the Department of Housing on this. I want to take a moment to just speak to sort of where we are now in our shelter system and where we're hoping to go. So pre-COVID, the city funded roughly 3,300 shelter beds. Of those, about a third were beds in shared rooms with over 20 people in shared bathrooms. And that was particularly for our single adult population. So for single adults, actually over 80% of beds were in shared rooms with over 20 people and shared bathrooms. So with Chicago Recovery Plan funding, as Matt said, we really have an opportunity to change this footprint. So the need for sort of new and more non-congregate space for shelters is a need we've heard from our shelter partners before the pandemic to better serve clients, safely and with dignity. It's a need we definitely saw during the pandemic to reduce the spread of COVID-19 and allow for isolation space and quarantine space. And this need was also reiterated in the COC relief funding work group recommendations to the city last year on how to sort of allocate American Rescue Plan funding overall. So as Matt shared, there's sort of a couple pathways that we're looking to sort of accomplish this change in the footprint of our shelter system. And part of that process is this acquisition of new non-congregate spaces. And so specifically with this acquisition strategy that we're talking about today, we're targeting conversion of about 300 shelter beds from congregate space to non-congregate space. So what do we mean when we say sort of non-congregate, and why does this matter? Our little chart here is to show that ideally non-congregate shelter will shift us from many shared beds or cots in one room and a shared bathroom to a space where each household, or at least only a couple households, have their own room and their own bathroom. And so based on experience in Chicago and nationwide during the pandemic, as folks were moved into hotel rooms, we saw just huge benefits of this for our clients, both in sort of limiting the spread of COVID-19 and other infectious diseases, but also sort of client outcomes overall. So higher rates of engagement with service providers, better access to permanent housing, reduced interpersonal conflict and emergencies, and generally sort of improved client feelings about their safety, their security, and optimism about the future. So we're extremely excited over here at the FSS to start moving this forward. And I'm going to pass it back over to Meredith to talk through a little bit more about the specifics of the RFP.
Thanks, Kim. So this program is aimed at providing capital funding to support the acquisition of existing buildings that can be used to provide critically needed shelter to people experiencing homelessness and other vulnerable Chicagoans. So the goal of this specific RFP, sort of within the ecosystem that we've already described, is to transition approximately 300 existing congregate shelter beds into non-congregate settings in multiple facilities. And our goal is to prioritize shelters who are in the greatest need of improved conditions. And then separately, in a separate RFP solicitation, we'll be working with CDPH to acquire space to implement their 60-bed stabilization housing pilot program for people with behavioral health conditions. You can see this RFP addresses the sort of first bucket. It will address some, not necessarily all, of the 300 beds we're looking to move. But that is where this RFP is aimed. So a couple of quick notes on what this program is and what it isn't. I'm trying to get really clear just so people know exactly what this is able to fund through the solicitation. So this program will be able to provide capital funding to shelter operators to acquire buildings for specific and restricted uses. We will select grant recipients to purchase, activate, and own property while operating buildings as emergency shelter. Some things this program is not and will not be able to do. The first is it's not going to involve the city of Chicago coming into title for any new property. So these are not city-owned buildings. These are buildings that we are granting funds for these RFP applicants to come into title for. This program is not able to provide shelter operations funding. Matt noted this earlier, but because of the funding source, all of the bond funding needs to be used for capitalizable expenses, which means we cannot fund operations through this funding. And then lastly, this program will not provide funds to repair existing shelter buildings. As noted in the earlier slides, there will be a separate RFP process for shelter infrastructure investments to do rehab to existing shelter buildings. So two separate solicitations with the same sort of aim, but one focused on building acquisition and the other focused on repair to existing buildings. And again, we can answer further detailed questions about this when we get to the Q&A. So let's go ahead and go into talking a little bit more about the RFP itself, what is entailed in the RFP, and then the actual application process. So I will be presenting some of this information. Again, I'm Meredith from the recovery plan team as a program manager, and Ryan will be joining me to walk through this section of the presentation. So at first, the purpose of this RFP, again, you've heard some of this before, but want to make sure it's super clear. We'll be using the solicitation process to first select existing shelter operators in need of new shelter space. Second, to provide technical assistance to support rapid acquisition of the property by the RFP grantee. Third, to support the purchase with grant funds from the city or Chicago Recovery Plan. And fourth, to establish a list of necessary repairs and accessibility improvements that need to be made within the first year of operations. So DOH is expecting to select 2 to 3 finalists in this current round. We may additionally reopen this RFP in the future, pending availability of additional funding. I'm going to pass it over to Ryan.
Okay, now we're gonna cover who's eligible to apply. So this is obviously a competitive process, and it's open to nonprofit entities who currently operate 1 or more emergency transitional homeless shelters within the city of Chicago. These shelter operators may own, rent, or otherwise legally occupy the shelter's present location. And you must be in good standing with your current contracts. So respondents who are currently city delegates whose existing contracts are not in good standing will not be considered. And also just a note that future rounds of this RFP may broaden or further restrict eligibility. So please review any future solicitations at this link here. But for now, this is the only solicitation we have out. But that's just a note for the future.
So a little bit about the process. First is the applicant selection. So this RFP will be utilized to select shelter operators as grant finalists. Following selection, the department will work with to do engagement with the selected shelter operator and residents to provide feedback on shelter needs. Following that, DOH will partner with the selected grantee to assess buildings based on the needs of the shelter and work with the grantee to negotiate a sale of the building that best fits those needs. Following that is the closing process. The city will provide acquisition capital to the RFP grant recipient and will establish requirements for repairs, for zoning, for accessibility, etc. And upon the grantee closing the sale, the site implementation will begin where shelter operations start and repairs are completed within the first year. This whole process will repeat for any additional RFP solicitations. So I'll pass it back to Ryan.
So I know there's probably some questions about what kinds of buildings can be purchased. So our overall goal, once again, is just to increase non-congregate shelter beds across Chicago and provide space that fits the priorities for best practice shelter operations. So key building features include private rooms for individuals and unit bathrooms and sanitary facilities, ability to create communal space and accessible rooms. We have been scouting some potential sites prior to this RFP launch and have identified some candidate buildings. These motels generally are California style buildings, meaning they have exterior entrances to them. They have between 24 and 36 rooms, and they were built between 1950 and 1970. They all contain 2 floors and have laundry space and storage space and some parking spots, but none of the spaces currently have any communal space or any individual rooms that qualify as ADA accessible, but they were chosen as finalists through DFSS's priorities that kind of include location, readiness for occupancy, ability to create those communal spaces, and the ability to convert them into ADA, the rooms into being ADA accessible. It's also an option that applicants can propose a separate building if selected as a grantee finalist. And if applicants already have a property in mind, they should describe it in the relevant section of the RFP.
So in terms of grantee selection, we are looking at 3 key criteria for evaluation. First is mission alignment, excuse me, and shelter operations experience. We're looking for an agency that has experience and capacity to operate shelter for people experiencing homelessness or survivors of gender-based violence, and for agencies that have a trauma-informed, low-barrier approach to housing and healthcare. Second, we're looking for shelters who are in need of new shelter space. So substantive need proven by physical attributes, financial attributes, or changing conditions for the current shelter operations, and a focus on the solicitation round in particular for urgent and critical needs. Third, we are assessing on readiness and capacity to own. So financial and operational capacity to both operate and own shelter space. And then ownership obligations, including the ability to take on site acquisition, to go through the rezoning process, to complete unit turnover repairs, accessibility modifications, and potential rehabilitation repairs within that first year. So our goal is really to select applicants we believe we can help move quickly, because this first round is focused on urgent and critical needs. As we mentioned before, we do plan to hopefully open future rounds of this with further focuses. I'll pass it back to Ryan.
These are some important dates we want everybody to keep in mind. We're already here at the bidders conference. We're going to publish an FAQ, and then the solicitation closes on October 17th. So that's obviously an important date to keep in mind. We'll notify you by the end of October. And then we are trying obviously to move as quickly as possible as winter is coming to acquire these buildings, but due to the nature of these kinds of transactions, we can't be exactly sure how long it'll take to close on properties. And we're somewhat uncertain about some of the costs of rehabilitation. So there is a little bit of wiggle room within these dates. And there's a possibility of reopening this RFP next year with the additional remaining funding, if there is additional funding.
So the application process itself, all relevant information about this RFP will be posted on our website. The RFP solicitation text is already posted there, along with some additional information. This recording and this slide deck will be posted there as well once we finish up with this bidders conference. And then we'll be posting an FAQ as well. The last thing that's posted there is a link to Submittable, which is the online application platform we're using for this solicitation. All responses will need to be submitted on Submittable. I can talk a little bit about what that looks like. So a couple quick notes is that you need to both log in and create an account on the Submittable page. That's the account that you'll be using for the whole submission process. So please make sure to keep note of the username and password. We're expecting applications to be thorough, but there's no expectation to consult with outside entities, including consultants, attorneys, or other external partners to complete the application. We know that the solicitation turnaround time is somewhat quick because we're, again, working to address urgent needs. So we're asking that people, complete to the best of your ability, but there is no need, again, to go into really deep detail. In particular, part of the application is a case study where we're looking really to learn more about how you would engage in turnover, accessibility, and possible rehab repairs. This has questions about both the types of repairs you would complete and questions about cost. None of these things need to be super exact, especially on the costing side. We're really looking to learn more about how you engage with thinking through what's needed to move a building from how it currently operates to being operated as a non-congregate shelter space. There are 9 sections. You see them listed here. There are lots of descriptions built into the Submittable platform, as well as links back to the RFP PDF itself. And if you have questions as you go through the process, you are able to email shelteracquisition@cityofchicago.org, to ask those questions. There are also ways within the submittable application itself to, I believe, ask questions through that portal. Both are clickable, and we'll be checking both regularly for questions. So with that, we are going to move into the Q&A portion of this. We know there are a number of questions already in the Q&A chat, which is great. We'll also have opportunities for people to come off of mute and ask particular questions. Very quickly, as an introduction, most of these people you've seen already on your screen, but here's who's going to be answering your questions. Matt Stern, myself, Brian, Michelle Pinar, who's an underwriter and project manager with the Department of Housing. And then from the Department of Family and Support Services, Kim Howard, along with Amy Cornell, who is a project manager with the Department of Family and Support Services. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan. Ryan, if you can walk through this slide, and then I'm going to take down the presentation so that our participants can see the full panel of folks who are answering questions.
Okay, so we're going to move into the Q&A portion of this. So this recording will be posted to our website within the next couple of days. If we receive questions here that could benefit from written answers, we will send out an email by 5 p.m. on Wednesday, and we will publish a FAQ by October 7th. You can also email us at the email that we put into the chat if you have other questions. We will not answer questions about this RFP in any format besides for this webinar and the forthcoming FAQ document, though, just as a note there. So I think now we can start moving into some of the questions that folks have put into the Q&A. We could answer some of those live, so I'm going to read some of them off and direct them to the appropriate staff who might have the answers for those. I'm seeing a lot of questions regarding properties and properties mostly. So I think one of the questions I've seen a few times is, will a list of property addresses be available to evaluate? So Matt, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So we are, as was mentioned, working with a number of properties, but because we don't have a agreement with the properties at this point, with a sort of a fixed price or anything like that, we don't want to publicize that information quite yet. We're hoping that respondents who are eligible apply to the RFP regardless of whether or not there's a property that we've already identified. Because of course, if you're selected, we can work with you to figure out, what the right property is, even if we don't currently have something that fits the bill that we're looking at. We may be able to get to a place before the RFP closes where we can publish information on specific properties. I think more likely finalists will work with DFSS and DOH staff to look at the properties we've identified.
Thanks for that, Matt. Another question I've seen a few times is regarding the definition of non-congregate shelter. So I see a question here that says, do the bathrooms need to be in the client's bedrooms, or is a bathroom adjacent to the room sufficient? So I don't know if Matt or Kim wants to answer this one.
I can jump in on this one. So our sort of ideal definition of non-congregate is that each household has their own sort of sleeping area and bathroom. That bathroom does not need to be sort of within the sleeping area or necessarily attached to the sleeping area. And I was also seeing questions on, it looks like there's some flexibility on not perfectly meeting that definition of non-congregate. Can we speak a little bit more to that? So I will note here that through this RFP, we may fund acquisition of facilities that do not sort of meet that strict definition of sort of one household per room and bathroom, if that is sort of providing substantial improvements over existing conditions of a shelter. And I think this is really to work within the realities of maintaining bed capacity in our system, limitations of cost. And so those would be conversations had after awardees are selected as part of the facility selection process.
Thanks, Kim. Another question I've seen a few times is if this RFP is to purchase a building only and not for land. So Matt, do you want to take that?
Sure. Our intention with this first round of the RFP is to focus on existing buildings, specifically because we are hoping to move fairly quickly with this first round, and building new would obviously take a substantially longer period of time. However, this is exactly the sort of thing that might change for future iterations of this RFP. So if that's something that's of interest to you, I would look out for modifications to this RFP that we may be able to launch in 2023.
Thanks, Matt. Another question I see here is, will an environmental study be done on the properties that DOH is pursuing as possible options? So maybe Meredith, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, happy to do so. So we are expecting that at least a phase 1 environmental review will be completed for the buildings. We want to make sure that the spaces that we are starting to, that the city or that recipients start to use as non-congregate shelter space are safe and are not going to pose environmental hazards. And so we'll be working with the Department of Assets, Information and Systems here at the city to make sure that that's done up to standard. And that's something that the department will be able to hopefully help and provide technical support on. And in some cases with some of these potential properties already being scoped, may start that process in advance of selection, just to make sure that's not a time constraint issue.
Hey,
Thanks,
Ryan,
Ryan.
I
Yep.
see that someone has their hand up. Do we want to take that question now?
Yeah, that's great.
Aisha, I'm going to allow, I hope I'm saying your name correct. I'm going to allow you to talk. So feel free to come off mute and ask your question. Okay, well, maybe it was answered in the chat. So I will move you back down, but if you think of your question again, feel free to raise your hand again.
Thanks for pointing that out, Erin. If anybody does want to ask questions verbally, feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll keep going through some of the ones that have been entered into the Q&A. I see another question here that's asking if there's going to be a preference given to people that are using existing spaces. So Meredith, do you want to try and answer that one?
Yes, can you repeat that one more time for me?
Is preference going to be given to, it says RFPs that use the existing spaces? I'm not sure if that means like are the ones that we've been scoping or.
Yeah, I'll answer sort of how I understand the question, but please let us know if we sort of missed the nuance of what you're looking for. So as we mentioned earlier, the goal is to transition current shelter operations that are in highly congregate space or in need of space improvements into new non-congregate spaces. And so in the RFP, you'll see sort of in those 3 evaluation sections, both the need for new space is one of the considerations we're looking at, and then readiness and capacity to own and operate. And so one of the things we'll be looking for is to make sure that the entity has operating capacity, so has funding available to run shelter operations. Because this RFP is not able to provide funding to support shelter operations, we want to ensure that that funding is already there for the entity. And so some sort of proof of either current operations and how those are funded, or funding that you have available to operate a shelter space. And then in terms of if you're already currently operating a shelter, again, we're sort of assessing against the need for that new space. There's not a strict requirement that you are already operating a shelter, but we would need to see sort of in the answers to the questions justification for why this space would fit with your organization. And then just to reiterate, if the operations you have in place right now, or if you're looking to start new operations. We're going to have future rounds of this for future hopeful site acquisitions. And so if you're, in the midst of looking for funding for operations, or you're looking to start operating a shelter, then we'd encourage you to focus on the operations piece right now to make sure that funding is in place for when we open future rounds of this version of the RFP for space acquisition.
Thanks, Meredith. I see another question here. I think we've mostly answered, but I want to make sure to reiterate. So it says, how does site selection work? Are they city-owned properties? And does the applicant have to look for properties? As we kind of had said before, we have been scoping some properties. So those are options, but you can also bring your own properties if you want to. So you can look for properties, but you don't have to. And the properties that we're currently looking at are not city-owned. And I see another question here, and it says, is the overall goal for DFSS to move away from congregate settings and only fund non-congregate shelters in the future? So Kim, do you want to take that one?
Sure thing. Yeah, I appreciate this question. I think as you'll see in sort of this RFP and future funding rounds, we really are seeking to use sort of this one-time Chicago Recovery Plan funding to transition as many beds as we can in our existing shelter system from congregate spaces to non-congregate spaces. However, that does not mean that in sort of future shelter operations funding rounds, the DFSS will only be funding non-congregate shelter.
Thanks, Kim. I see another question here, and it asks, can newer organizations apply for this round? Meredith, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. So there's no requirement on how long an organization has been operating. And we're happy to hear that there are new entities interested in adding to the sort of shelter ecosystem in the city. That's a great thing. Clearly, there's a high need for more shelter space throughout the city. That being said, I'll just reiterate what I mentioned earlier, which is that we're aiming to identify and evaluate based on the need for new shelter space and the capacity for an entity to be able to both own and operate the shelter and the building. So as you look through the application, you'll see spaces for the organization to provide evidence of financing, to provide experience in how you've operated and managed a shelter in the past. And so this round, again, with the focus on urgent needs for new space may not be the best fit, but we definitely encourage you to both, look through the application, complete if it makes sense for your organization, and then keep an eye out for future rounds as they come out with sort of differing focuses for site acquisition.
Thanks, Meredith. See a question here, and it says, will there be a set aside in the funding for future repairs? So Matt, do you want to take that one?
Sure, thanks. We are not currently imagining with this funding stream a set aside for future repairs. There may be an opportunity through related programs that the city offers, such as the upcoming DFSS RFP, for example, that do more specifically fund repairs. In terms of what would be covered under this RFP, and there are a few questions in the Q&A related to sort of the distinction between acquisition costs and rehab costs. Both acquisition and rehab are eligible expenses under this grant program, and the goal would be to come out that a grantee from this program would leave with a space that is in good shape, right, and that hopefully would not need substantive repairs in the near future. But no, there is not a sort of a separate set aside for future repairs here. And I think that connects to some questions I think have already been answered about sort of evidence of financing. One of the reasons why the application asks the questions that it does about what is your shelter's existing financing sources and how stable are those sources is recognizing that because this funding opportunity is capital in nature and isn't operational in nature, that we definitely don't want to be in a position where we're setting anyone up for anything less than total success in terms of their ability to upkeep the building going forward. I hope that answers the question, but happy to clarify further.
And I think there's a question very closely related to this one, but maybe a little bit different. And it asks about how, if you have a partner who would acquire the site, could all of the funds be used for rehabbing? So you want to follow up on that one?
Sure. Yeah, there's both acquisition and rehab, like I said, are eligible under this program. So there's not necessarily no hard and fast rule about that money being used in a certain percentage for A or B. So no is the short answer. I want to note that there is certain stipulations whenever the city of Chicago supports construction. There are sort of a variety of rules and requirements that come with that, including prevailing wage, MBE, WBE, et cetera. And so I think one of the conversations that we would want to have with a selected grantee who is in a situation like that would be balancing sort of what the different sources of funds get used from, trying to optimize that as much as possible.
Thanks, Matt. I see a hand, Aaron. Let's see, Eric has their hand up.
Yeah. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Okay, so I was looking at the RFP. Are you able to hear me? I just want to check.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, as I was looking at the RFP, I don't know if this is too detailed of a question. I saw where you were asking for the organization's overall funding for shelter services and operations. If we're as an organization do more than just, emergency shelter is one of 4 different things that we do. Are you looking for just the funding we get for the shelter piece, or are you looking for our overall organization's funding? And is it just, the operations of it also?
I can answer that question. It's a great question. We are very aware that lots of the organizations who operate shelter also operate a variety of other types of programming. We are focused specifically on your capacity to own and operate. So I think it's relevant for sure for you to share the funding that you have for your current shelter operations. And if you think there's any other funding that your agency is receiving that would, help to bolster your argument and justification for your capacity to serve as owner and operator, then I would encourage you to include that as well. But we don't need a breakdown of the entirety of your organization's funding structure. Really, what's relevant to this solicitation.
But the general operating, any funding we get for general operations too, that is, our choice to fund whatever program you'd be interested in seeing that type of information too.
I would imagine that could be helpful. It helps us to see sort of what you have flexibility with, the amount of funding that you're sort of being able to flex in different spaces. So I could see that being pretty prevalent.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Thanks for that question. I see a question here that's asking about if grantees are going to be chosen based on their location to the identified properties. And I would say that the answer to that is no. As we kind of spoke about earlier, and as you can see in the RFP, the criteria we're really looking at is the readiness to own and the need for new shelter space. So I think the quick answer to that question is that it's not going to be based off of where an organization is currently located. I see another question here asking if it is possible for a project to be fully funded, or will additional funds be needed to be secured by the applicant? Matt, do you want to take that one?
Sure, we are absolutely interested if your organization has other funding that can be paired with city funding, especially in the situation where you're bringing a building to the table, or there's a property you're already interested in, but no, there's not a requirement that you have existing funding. Like I think we've said a handful of times before, within that acquisition and rehab space, those are both eligible costs, and there's not necessarily a mandated cost share or a required contribution from the recipient.
Thanks, Matt. I see somebody who's asking if they would be eligible if they have a space where it's a lease to buy option. Meredith, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think we'd have to explore it a little bit more with you, but I think, you know, with the goal of this program to be acquiring space, if you're able to sort of move to that option to buy portion of the current leasing arrangement, then I think that's something that wouldn't preclude you from applying. That sounds like it would be a workable situation. Again, we would need to know more of the details, and you can explain the full situation in the RFP application in the section under need for non-congregate shelter space.
Thanks, Meredith. See a few questions remaining here. One is asking if there's an idea to acquire 2 properties that are in close proximity, one to be shelter and one to be more shelter and or permanent housing with supportive services could both be included in one application. My colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the idea here is to fund shelter space. So I don't think we would yet be funding permanent supportive housing. That might be an option in the future to convert it into permanent supportive housing, but right now we are doing just shelter. And if you had a program, say, that was too big for just one of the spaces we're looking at, I do believe there would be the possibility to have multiple properties acquired on your behalf to fit your entire program. But I think once again, that's something we would be talking about as we do the scoping portion of it after someone is selected as a grantee through the RFP. And then I see a question asking if there is a limit on the amount of funding available for a selected project. Matt, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, no, there is not a specific number that's attached to the RFP. One of the reasons that we are interested in doing a couple of projects this fall and then potentially reopening the RFP next year is that we are not yet confident in how much a project like this is going to cost. So we are looking forward to working with the selected grantees to figure that out together. And then as additional funding is available, that will help us scope the work we do next year and in the years to come.
Thanks, Matt. I see a question here that says if we are currently operating non-congregate space that is not ideal for clients that we rent, can we apply if we are looking to purchase space? And I would say that the answer to that is yes. I mean, we are trying to help people move from spaces that are, that's kind of like we were getting to within, they have great need for repairs, or right, you're operating in a space that's not appropriate for the people that you are serving. So we want to be able to move people from those spaces into spaces that are more appropriate. So I'd say that the answer to that question is yes. Another question, very specific question here. The application only allows for 3 shelters to be mentioned and they have 4. Should they leave out any that are not fully congregate? Meredith, want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, we definitely understand that some applicants may have more than 3 shelter spaces they operate. We limited it to 3 just to limit the amount of effort needed to be put into this RFP solicitation. You can certainly mention sort of somewhere within your solicitation, your total sort of count of shelter operations. But yeah, I would recommend that of the 3 that you list, that you choose to list, you definitely include the ones that are in need of being transitioned to non-congregate shelter space. So I would start with the top priority and then work your way down. This question helps us not only sort of determine your experience with shelter operations, but then helps us think about and start to engage with the question of your need for non-congregate shelter space. So prioritize the ones that are in greatest need. Again, only 1 is needed to be completed for the sort of previous shelter operations experience. You can include up to 3. It's sort of a choice of your entity. You're not going to be evaluated differently if you submit 1 versus 3. We just wanted to allow the space for you to provide sort of a fuller scope of the work of your agency.
Thanks, Meredith. That's all the questions I saw in the Q&A. If anybody feels we misunderstood your question, I would invite you to come off of you, just raise your hand so that we can more properly understand your question and get you the answer you need. Oh, I see a hand. Let's see. Looks like Andrew.
Okay, Andrew, you should be able to speak.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you. I just want to ask this one verbally so I don't get too far in the weeds. But in the application, under evidence of financing, there's kind of 4 evidences listed there: line of credits, letter of commitment, or bank account showing sufficient liquid financial assets. So thinking of our organization and the cost of this project, knowing that the grant will absolutely exceed any liquid assets we have, is how do we meet that requirement without the need for a kind of bridge financing? What would be a recommended offering in that evidence, if that makes sense?
I can attempt to answer, but any others are more than welcome to join in. Yeah, we're very aware that this is this program operates a little bit differently from how our multifamily affordable development program operates, where there are those larger items there. I think that the goal here is really just to see either that you have credits available to you. It does not need to be to the amount of the size of this grant. I think we're just looking to see that you do have finance support available to you, and that you're able to continue through with the operations of the program while we work together on the funding for the site acquisition side of things. Matt, if you have anything you want to add to that, feel free.
No, I think that's exactly right, Meredith. We're not looking for proof of ability to finance this project. That's exactly what we're trying to provide with this grant program. We're looking for evidence of financial sustainability of your organization, and open to receiving that in a variety of ways. We wanted the question to be broad to invite the documentation that would work for any given organization.
Okay, thanks for that. And thanks, Andrew, for your question. Is there anybody else who wants to raise their hand or ask a question verbally? Otherwise, I think we've answered all the Q&A questions. And there's always the option to email the email that we provided if there are technical questions related to the application.
I think Andrew has his hand up again.
Sorry, all. Yeah, one more quick question regarding
No worries.
zoning modification and all that, and alderperson relationships in the wards where these may be at. Will there be kind of a roundtable meeting or something with those departments so we can do this, or will the applicant be required to retain zoning attorney and all that? Thank you.
The Department of Housing is hoping to offer technical assistance in that category, broadly speaking, including assisting with zoning changes to the extent that they're needed. Are we able to, hire a lawyer on someone's behalf if that ends up being needed? No, probably not. But our hope is that we can help any grantee navigate the city and zoning and other sorts of building permit approval processes in a manner that facilitates the project.
There's
Matt.
another hand up by Leonard. Okay, Leonard, you're able to speak, so feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me now? Sorry. Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I want to go back to what you've already actually shared with us. Could you describe the residents again that you
You're kind of going in and out. It's a little bit hard to hear.
can you share the describe the residents?
Hi, Leonard. It's very difficult actually to hear you. So it'd be best if you can put your question in the Q&A.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, I didn't have my mic. No? Okay,
It's really going in and out, unfortunately. So we hear you and then
Sorry.
it sort of fades.
sorry. Okay, I'll put it.
Thanks. But Ryan, there is another question in the Q&A.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. The question is, can we use funds to convert our current shelter into a non-congregate shelter? Matt, you want to take that?
Yeah, I can take that. If you currently own a building that that you own, that you have control over, that you operate as a congregate shelter, if I'm understanding correctly, then theoretically, yes. I want to reinforce that the application, while you are able to sort of suggest a building or a specific project in the application, the eligibility and selection criteria for this first round are very much based on the need for shelter and not necessarily the presentation of a viable solution. If we select your application, we would then work with you on any of a variety of options. And if one of them is making improvements to a building you own, I think that would be something that we would be able to talk to you about.
Thanks, Matt. I see another question from Leonard. It says, who are the residences you're intending to serve? Intermediate or emergency funding? So I'm thinking that means transitional versus emergency shelter. Pam, you want to take that?
Yeah, I can speak to this. I think for this funding round specifically, we're really looking to target sort of emergency shelter providers. So folks who are providing sort of a safe place to stay on a temporary basis for people experiencing homelessness before they can exit to a more permanent destination.
Thanks, Kim. I don't see any more questions, so I think we've reached the end of our time together here today. So if you have other questions, feel free to reach out to the email that we provided in the chat. And once again, kind of like we had said, this will be posted, and there will also be an FAQ that's created and posted to our webpage as well.
I want to reinforce a point that Ryan made on the last slide when we were still screen sharing. If you have pertinent questions that you weren't able to get answered here, please send them to us as soon as possible so that we can attempt to incorporate answers to those questions into the FAQ before the end of the week. We are not allowed to respond to substantive questions individually, which is one of the reasons why we publish the FAQ, one of the reasons why we have this event, so that all of our answers can be public and fully transparent. So take a look at the application the next couple of days. If you have other questions, get it to us quickly, and we'll do our best to include answers in that document at the end of this week.
And just want to thank everybody for being here, and thank you all for the work that you do. So thanks for your time, and thanks for, I know shelter isn't always the easiest thing to do, so I'm hoping that this program can be helpful in creating a more different shelter ecosystem. So thanks for coming.
Real quick,